Yeah, that's it. You're gonna video this?
It's for Uncle John. I know he'd love to be here.
Everybody's looking at me. Now I'm nervous.
Just sing it.
All right, here goes.
Here around this picnic table, and their places young and able. See the faces, old and stable, all related. It's like a fable. At the table here for years, the food is served and disappears. Someone sets, someone clears, but everybody volunteers. Yeah, everybody volunteers. It's Uncle What and Auntie Who. They visit every month or two. When is it ever not a feast? Pick over the leftovers at least. And Grandma wearing cousin Red. Remember how it was back then. It's always fun to bring your friends, even vegetarians. We come from far and wide on your shoulders that we ride on. The sons you keep your eye on, the soldiers we rely on, the daughters taking care of business, do their share of the children in our care for. That's who we are there for. Yeah, that's who we are there for.
Cousin Jam.
Hey, they're pretty good together.
Buster, you're up.
Family is a state of mind, so take your place, relax, unwind.
If you look, I think you'll see there are many kinds of family. Now this is what I call family, y'all. Woo! So here around the picnic table, in their places, young and able, old and stable, you can see if you hear your family.
If you hear your family.
Watch Arthur, weekdays on your PBS Kids station, or anytime on the PBS Kids video app.